Are you into dusty trails, jaw-dropping shootouts, and that wild rebel vibe of the Old West? Then stick around because today's ride is about to bust everything you thought you knew about that era. We've rounded up 25 myths that Hollywood turned into gospel, but in real life they're nothing more than studio-made fiction. With each topic, you'll see how the frontier was a whole lot different from what the big screen showed us. Before you tip your hat and saddle up, hit that like button to help support the channel. Not part of our gang yet? Smash that subscribe button and turn on the bell. Our next stops are going to uncover stories that never made it to Hollywood's credits. Number 1. The Stetson hat. On the big screen, the hero shows up in a curved Stetson as the sun sets behind him. Seems inevitable, right? But out on the real trails, it was all about improvisation. For much of the 19th century, cowboys wore whatever they had on hand to cover their heads. The bowler hat, yes, the one we associate with London bankers, actually ruled the prairies because it didn't fly off in the wind. Some made use of leftover military caps from the Civil War. Others went with wide-brimmed sombreros, perfect for the brutal sun. The look out there was anything but uniform. The Stetson didn't make its debut until 1865 with the Boss of the Plains model. Sturdy and rain-resistant, it had a tall crown and flat brim. Nothing like the dramatic shape Hollywood later made famous. Over time, cowboys themselves started steaming and shaping the felt to form curves that helped water run off, or just to show some flair. It caught on, sure, but it shared the range with all kinds of headgear. So why does our collective memory picture just one kind of hat? Buffalo Bill Cody brought the Stetson to the stage with his traveling Wild West show and turned it into a symbol of the fearless frontiersman. Decades later, movies locked in the myth with one easy visual trick. Light-colored hats for the good guys, dark ones for the bad guys. Just a few reels of film were enough to wipe out the real-life variety. Next time you see that silhouette on the horizon, remember, behind that wide brim lies a much more complicated story. Number 2. Bearded cowboys. When we picture cowboys, what comes to mind? Maybe a clean-shaven rider, sharp hat, and a shiny revolver. That image, polished up by Hollywood, hides the rough reality of life on the trail driving cattle across dry, dusty plains. For weeks, sometimes months, days started before sunrise and didn't end until the last steer settled down. With that kind of grind, shaving dropped to the bottom of the list. Water was rationed, razors broke, and mirrors rarely rode along in the saddle. The result? Beards grew wild, mustaches took on bold shapes, and clothes, picked for price and toughness, bore the marks of every mile. Only after delivering the herd and collecting their pay would these men go looking for a real bath, a sharp razor, and clean clothes to stroll through town. Even then, many kept their bearded look, a common style in the 19th century. The change didn't come until much later, when Hollywood studios in the 1940s and 50s decided a clean-cut jawline sold more tickets. They shaved off the truth in a single marketing move and gave the world a cowboy who never really existed. If even the beard got rewritten, just imagine what else we've still got to uncover about the Old West. Number 3. White cowboys. Have you ever heard that old idea that the Wild West was the exclusive domain of white cowboys? Well, that image, repeated in countless movies and dime store novels, hides a much more colorful reality that dominated the cattle trails right after the Civil War. For every 4 cowboys riding the plains, one was black, formerly enslaved people who saw in the dust of the prairie a shot at freedom and a paying job. Riding alongside them was a large Hispanic workforce, sometimes making up a third of the crew. Many of them Mexican vaqueros who brought with them the techniques, saddles, ropes, and even the language that would become part of the cowboy identity. And it doesn't stop there. Native peoples who knew those lands long before fences drove cattle for miles, while Chinese immigrants traded railroad hammers for wide-brimmed hats. If the scene was so diverse, why did the screen stick to one shade of hero? The answer lies behind the curtain of the entertainment industry back then. To sell 10-cent novels and matinee tickets, producers leaned into the prejudices of the time. Minorities were either erased or turned into caricatures, locking in a myth that still echoes every time the sound of spurs signals another high noon showdown. Number 4. Tall, towering cowboys. When you close your eyes and picture the Old West, chances are you see a giant in a wide-brimmed hat, stepping down from the saddle like some kind of superhero. That image, hammered into our heads by decades of movies, leaves the real prairie scene out of frame. The cowboys driving massive herds down dusty trails were nothing like John Wayne. The average height was around 5'5", weighing between 120 and 150 pounds, just right for spending long days on small, quick ponies. That lightweight build worked almost like a jockey's. Less weight meant less strain while riding dozens of miles under the brutal sun. It's simple logic, but the myth bulked up once Hollywood started filling the screen with broad-shouldered, deep-voiced men who could command every inch of the frame and earn respect before even drawing their gun. The result? Audiences began linking heroism to extra inches and forgot that out in the real dust, efficiency always mattered more than looks. Now that this camera trick is out in the open, it's easier to see past the movie costume. After all, the real adventure of the West didn't always fit into size 12 boots. Number 5. Cowboys always armed. The image of a cowboy with a six-shooter swinging from his holster feels natural thanks to the movies, but it was almost never part of these workers' daily lives. The average cowboy spent hours riding, fixing fences, and driving cattle under the hot sun. Carrying a heavy handgun meant constant discomfort and a higher risk of accidental discharge. On top of that, revolvers were expensive and needed regular maintenance. Many ranch owners made it clear: no firearms on the job. Less chance of bar fights, fewer spooked animals. When real threats came around, cowboys actually preferred rifles or shotguns. Better range for scaring off predators or hunting food. What they really needed on their belts were ropes, utility knives, or maybe a hammer to deal with fence nails. The image of the leather-clad gunslinger, ready to draw faster than his own shadow, was born in the sensational pages of cheap dime novels and boosted by early Hollywood studios, hungry for shootouts, gunpowder, and lone wolf heroes. And if that myth already shook up what you thought you knew, just wait. The next one reveals something even more surprising about the Wild West. Number 6. A life full of adventure. Ever pictured a cowboy riding into the sunset, pistol on his hip, ready for a cinematic showdown? Yeah, that popular image owes more to Hollywood scripts than to the dusty fields where cattle actually moved. The real daily grind demanded brute effort and endless hours in the saddle. Before the rooster even crowed, it was time to round up hundreds of cattle and push them for miles, under blazing heat or biting cold. Behind that brown hat was sweat, mud, blistered hands, and a paycheck that was practically symbolic, sometimes not even $1 a day. And beyond the exhaustion, there was another constant companion: loneliness. Entire days would pass without a town in sight, just the creak of the saddle and the lowing of cattle. One wrong step, a sudden storm, or a spooked herd could lead to serious injuries or quiet deaths, far from the gunfire Hollywood loves to show. Even so, they had to keep going. Cattle don't wait. Every sunrise brought the same challenge and the same hope: to reach the next pasture in one piece. So next time you see a shiny spurred hero saving damsels, remember that the real story was written in dust and calluses, not gunshots and applause. Number 7. Cowboys and their horses. When we think of a cowboy, the scene that usually jumps to mind is a lone man, hat tilted just right, riding his loyal four-legged partner into a fiery sunset. That image pops up in movies so often it feels like a fact. But off-screen, the reality in the Old West was a whole different story. Most cowboys showed up at ranches with nothing more than worn-out clothes and the grit to handle long days. The horse was already waiting for them in a stable owned by the ranch boss. These animals were work tools, picked for their stamina and ability to handle cattle for hours on end, not for the kind of looks that'd land them on a Western movie poster. Instead of the majestic stallions Hollywood loves to show off, what you actually saw were quick, tough ponies built to run, turn on a dime, and keep going day after day. So yeah, the legend of the unbreakable bond between man and horse kicks up more dust than the trail ever did. And sure, it makes for a better story, but it stays just that, a legend. Number 8. Cowboys versus Native Americans. The image of cowboys locked in constant battle with native peoples fits just fine on the big screen, but not in the day-to-day life of the Old West. In westerns, the clash between white gunslingers and hostile Indians leads to chases and shootouts. Out on the actual plains, the cowboys' journey looked a lot different. Long rides after cattle, careful planning before crossing rivers, and cold nights standing watch. Direct confrontations between cowhands and native villages were rare. The ones who led large-scale campaigns against native nations were mainly the U.S. Army, following orders to clear land for settlers. The average cowboy just tried to avoid trouble and get the herd to market in one piece. Even so, screenwriters leaned into the cowboy versus Indian showdown as an easy way to build tension, reinforcing colonial stereotypes and oversimplifying deep issues of land, culture, and power. In the next scene, we'll take a closer look at how this myth took hold and why it still sticks in the popular imagination. Number 9. A lawless land. Picture arriving on a dusty street, the saloon doors creaking and knowing that one wrong look could end in a high-noon showdown. That scene, played out in countless movies, pulls us in because it promises danger and glory. But once the legend's dust settles, a very different picture comes into focus. Most frontier towns quickly realized that surviving everyday life meant having clear rules. Shopkeepers needed to open their doors without fear of looting. Cattle ranchers wanted to sleep in peace, and railroad companies had tracks to protect. That's how local ordinances came about. Sheriffs got elected, and town councils stepped up to set boundaries. Riders often checked their guns at the sheriff's office or hotel counter before even looking for a place to stay. Shootouts did happen, but they were rare. When formal law enforcement was missing, volunteer patrols kept the peace and settled disputes fast, stopping grudges from turning into bloodshed. So the frontier wasn't a wild free-for-all, it was a constantly evolving system. Once you see the gap between myth and reality, the Old West takes on a whole new dimension, and every jingle of spurs starts to sound more like an agreement than a fight. Number 10. The famous high noon duels. That classic duel set for high noon with a silent street and the clock about to strike was born in the movies, not in the actual records of the Old West. Historical accounts mention formal duels only rarely. The showdown between Wild Bill Hickok and Davis Tutt is almost the lone example. In real life, gunfire broke out without warning. A shove at the bar, a card game gone bad, an ambush in an alley. These shootouts were messy and close range, with people ducking behind barrels, swinging doors, or any shadow that could offer cover. No one wanted to be a sitting duck in the middle of a dusty street. Even the word gunslinger came later, coined by headline-hungry writers and later turned into a badge of honor by Hollywood in the 1920s. The clock striking 12 became a suspense trick, an invisible hourglass holding the audience's breath as two rivals count every second before the first shot tears through the air. Number 11. The most famous shootout of the Old West. Most people don't realize that the most famous shootout of the Old West didn't actually happen where the name claims it did. At sunset on October 26, 1881, Wyatt Earp, Doc Holliday, and company faced off not inside the fences of the OK Corral, but in a narrow vacant lot next to it, wedged between the stable and C.S. Fly's photography studio in Tombstone, Arizona. The whole thing was over in a flash, just 30 seconds and a few gunshots echoing through the desert, and there were already bodies on the ground. Still, gunfight at the OK Corral stuck in people's minds, because it sounds way more epic than shootout in a dusty alley. Thanks to a heavily romanticized biography of Wyatt Earp, Hollywood latched onto the name, turned the moment into legend, and repeated the mistake until it became official truth, on movie posters and in the public imagination. Number 12. The accuracy of revolvers. Picture that classic Western scene. The gunslinger spins the shiny cylinder, lifts his arm, and nails a tiny target from dozens of yards away. No hesitation. Sounds epic, right? But that image leans way more on Hollywood than on the gritty reality of black powder. Early six-shooters fired heavy rounds at pretty modest speeds. The bullets lost power fast and started to drop before even hitting the 50-foot mark. Misfires were common, and sometimes the gun would spark backward and startle the shooter. That's why, when range or stopping power really mattered, folks who knew the risks went with old rifles and shotguns. And as for that famous move, shooting the gun out of someone's hand, better to file that under stage trick. The lead bullets of the time would often deform or shatter on impact with metal, sending unpredictable fragments flying. One piece of advice often credited to Wyatt Earp still holds up. Speed is impressive, but it's accuracy, within the limits of physics, that wins the duel. In the end, the superpowers we give those old guns weren't about telling the truth. They were about giving the good guy a near mythical glow, fueling the legend that still lights up our screens today. Number 13. Saloon brawls. You've probably pictured those wild saloon brawls from the movies. Chairs flying, the piano player ducking for cover, bottles smashing left and right. But the reality was way more sober, and that might come as a surprise. Bar owners put whatever money they had into tables, glasses, and that old piano, and they weren't about to watch it all get wrecked for free. That's why, before the first punch was even thrown, many saloons had rules in place. No pistols at the bar, games under watch. And if things started to heat up, a bouncer would step in to cool it down. Fights did happen, of course, usually thanks to too much booze or a poker debt. But they rarely went beyond some shoving and a few muttered curses drowned out by the clink of coins in the till. The brawls that last for minutes on screen were, in real life, shut down in seconds. Just enough time for everyone to refill their glasses and for the music to start back up. The real Wild West didn't need Hollywood-style stunts to be dangerous, but it's got even more unexpected stories coming your way, so stick around. Number 14. The corrupt sheriffs. Imagine rolling into a small Old West town and realizing that, unlike what so many movies suggest, the guy wearing the badge isn't there to cower before gunslingers or pocket bribes from some rich rancher. The image of the bought-out sheriff makes for a handy villain and helps the lone hero shine on screen. But the real-life script played out a bit differently. Sure, there were cases of misconduct. Some deputies gave in to corruption, and at times even entire forces, like the Texas Rangers, crossed the line with abuse of power. But those were the loud exceptions, not the quiet rule. Most lawmen were up at dawn, riding miles on horseback, settling land disputes, calming rowdy saloons and locking the jailhouse door with little more than grit and resolve. Growing towns needed order, not scared extras. They needed people who could negotiate smartly and, when push came to shove, raise that badge as a symbol of real authority. The myth of the cowardly or crooked sheriff sticks around because it's convenient. A hero looks even braver when the law is weak. But off-screen, the badge usually stood for a real commitment to keeping the peace, not an open invitation to take a bribe. Number 15. Vigilantes and justice seekers. When the sheriff came up short and the courthouse was miles away, many frontier towns clung to the idea that determined neighbors were enough to bring back order. The image is familiar. Family men gathered by lamplight, marching together after an outlaw. But off-screen, the script looked a lot different, and rarely heroic. In 1856, San Francisco gave a raw snapshot of that thirst for instant justice. Over 6,000 residents formed what became known as the Vigilance Committee. Within months, they hanged suspects, forced politicians to resign, and raided homes without warrants. Juries and appeals? None. The logic was simple. If the courts are slow or corrupt, the taxpayers deliver the sentence. But down that fast track, old grudges, prejudice, and business rivalries suddenly looked like civic duty. What was sold as a shield for the community often turned into a weapon for lynching. The fascination with quick justice didn't die in the 19th century. Whenever bureaucracy stalls, the fantasy of lightning-fast punishment shows up again. It's tempting to swap due process for ropes and ballots for applause. But every step outside the law sets a precedent no one can control. And tomorrow, the accused might be anyone. Number 16. Gold everywhere. Imagine landing in San Francisco in 1849, hearing that all it took to get rich was digging your shovel into the river. The promise sounded simple: dig a hole, find a nugget, toast to your new life. But by the time most of the 49ers showed up, the easy gold was already claimed. The surface gold had become legend. What was left meant sifting through pebbles, digging frozen ravines, and washing tons of gravel to extract tiny flakes that barely paid for dinner. Meanwhile, around every bend popped up tents packed with shovels, boots, dried beans, and whiskey, all sold at prices that sparkled brighter than any nugget. Those merchants, not the miners, were the ones stacking real coins. They charged for everything: a bar of soap, a sip of coffee, even a warm spot to sleep after hours spent standing in icy water. The miner dreamed of that perfect nugget. The shopkeeper pocketed very real profits. When the big nuggets dried up, steam-powered machines, water channels, and explosives rolled in. Companies took over entire valleys, turning them into industrial dig sites no solo prospector could keep up with. The cycle repeated. Those with capital took what was left. Those relying on muscle went home with stories, not riches. And still, the myth lives on. The get-rich-quick tale remains irresistible, outshining the real story of mud, cold, and letdowns that defined the true gold rush experience. Number 17. Crossing the Old West on horseback was the norm. Imagine crossing the Old West relying only on a horse's trot. Sounds epic, but it doesn't tell the whole story. As the 19th century picked up steam, another iron giant appeared on the horizon: the locomotive. Tracks cut through the prairies, and within a few years, train cars were crossing plains that used to take weeks on horseback. Even the tiniest towns started hearing the train whistle and receiving goods that changed daily life in record time. Before that, stagecoaches carried the load. Covered wagons braved dust, rain, and bandits, hauling families, letters, and newspapers that later fueled saloon conversations. It was a bumpier ride, far less romantic than the lone rider, but crucial for keeping the West connected. So why does our collective memory fixate on the horse? Maybe because the silhouette of a cowboy against the sunset screams instant freedom. But the real Wild West ran on wheels, rails, and steam just as much as hooves. And that mix of technology and grit set the stage for the next big twist, one hardly anyone sees coming. Number 18. Russian Thistle. Picture the classic scene: dust hanging in the air, wind whistling, and in the emptiness of the main street, a dry bush breaks loose from the ground, tumbling along like it's looking for direction. That image has become a symbol of the Old West, a quick visual shortcut for loneliness and tension. But when the first frontier towns sprang up, there wasn't a single tumbleweed in sight. The star of that scene is the Russian thistle, a stowaway seed that arrived in the U.S. hidden in Russian flaxseed sacks in the 1870s. Once it hit the prairies, the invader sprouted fast, formed prickly balls, and pulled off a clever trick. Number 19. The women of the Old West. When we picture the red dust of the Old West, what usually comes to mind is lone gunslingers, high-noon duels, and saloons packed with wide-brimmed hats. But that classic frame leaves out a crucial part of the story: the women who helped build every town, road, and stretch of land. They were never on the sidelines. They were right there on the front lines. 1/3 of the land titles issued under the Homestead Act were in women's names, proof that the race for new farms also had skirts and worn-out boots. On mail delivery maps, you'll find Mary Stagecoach Fields, a black woman who rode through rough trails with the same grit as any driver. In shooting arenas, clay targets shattered under Annie Oakley's dead-eye aim, while Calamity Jane struck fear into outlaws. Charlotte Charlie Parkhurst drove stagecoaches disguised as a man to get around social barriers, and Native American writer Mourning Dove recorded the legends and struggles of her people. Ironically, the frontier offered many women a kind of freedom the fancy parlors back east denied. Some of the first co-ed colleges were built right there, in still developing territory. If the old movies left these names in the shadows, it's time to refocus. Behind the creak of swinging doors were women's voices, shaping the frontier story, ready to be heard. Number 20. Train robberies. Picture a locomotive slicing through the night, sparks flying into the air. In the popular imagination, masked riders appear out of nowhere, pull up alongside the train, leap onto the roof, and take over the engine. It feels like this happened every week, but the records tell a different story. Between 1866 and 1910, there were fewer than 1,000 train robberies in the U.S., an average of about 20 a year, spread across the entire country, not just the movie-famous West. So why did this crime become a symbol of the Old West? Because a train robbery has all the makings of a spectacle: speed, noise, and danger in plain sight. When the Great Train Robbery hit screens in 1903, it put that whole choreography center stage and shaped generations of filmmakers. Audiences started seeing the screen as a mirror of real life. The more movies showed bandits on boxcars, the more people believed that kind of violence was routine. And that's how a myth was born, one that still echoes in our minds every time a distant train whistle breaks the quiet of night. Number 21. The color of the hat. Picture the scene. Dust kicks up as two gunslingers face off in the middle of the street. For the viewer, there's no doubt who's on the right side of the story. The trick isn't in the script, it's in the color of the hat. Between the 1920s and 1940s, Western directors figured out that all they had to do was put a white hat on the hero and a black hat on the villain to guide the audience through intense black and white shootouts. The contrast worked like an instant moral compass. One glance, and the crowd knew who to root for. In real life, cowboys and outlaws made far less dramatic choices. They picked hats that were comfortable and could handle sun and dust, with no hidden meaning. Still, the movie solution stuck so hard it lasted for decades and jumped into other media. Look closely at the next game, comic, or TV show set in the Wild West. If there's a light-colored hat, odds are it belongs to the one offering a helping hand, not drawing a gun. And if it's a dark hat, get ready for the shot. Number 22. Native warriors. You've probably heard the story that all indigenous peoples of the Americas were bloodthirsty warriors, ready to attack any innocent settler who crossed their path. That storyline, popularized by dime novels, Buffalo Bill's Wild West shows, and old westerns, was handy for justifying invasions, but it's far from the truth. In reality, there were hundreds of indigenous nations, each with its own language, customs, and systems of government. When conflicts did happen, they were almost always in defense of ancestral lands, ways of life under threat, and treaties broken by the European newcomers pushing westward. Even the label Indian came from a geographic mistake that turned into a political tool. It was easier to paint a single faceless enemy than to acknowledge the deep diversity stretching from the Arctic to Patagonia. Sure, intertribal conflicts existed long before European contact, but boiling all that complexity down to some supposed universal urge for violence distorts history and silences vital voices. Next time someone repeats that myth, remember, the simple savage versus civilized narrative served the goals of conquest, not the truth. Number 23. The lone wolf. You've probably pictured that lone cowboy, hat low, horse at full gallop, handling everything on his own and riding off into the sunset. Yeah, that scene looks like it came straight off a movie poster, but it's a far cry from the reality that shaped the West. Life on the plains demanded more than solo bravery. It took teamwork. Driving large herds to the railroads required a full crew, each cowboy relying on the next to keep pace and protect the cattle. Caravans crossing indigenous territory only made it through thanks to lookouts on watch, makeshift cooks and blacksmiths ready to fix broken wheels. Even the gold rush ran on rough drafts of rules, written in wooden cabins where miners voted on shifts and how to split the findings. In a land of dust storms and unpredictable winters, the ones who made it were those who shared tools, shelter, and information. So before cheering on the movie version of the Lone Wolf, it's worth remembering. The real driving force behind the frontier was the trust forged between strangers chasing something bigger. Number 24. The Good Outlaws. When you hear the name Jesse James, you probably picture a Wild West vigilante, the outlaw who robbed from the rich and gave to the poor. But does that legend hold up under closer inspection? Right after the Civil War, Jesse James and his gang began robbing banks and trains tied to businessmen who had funded the Union troops he once fought against as a Confederate guerrilla. That detail alone was enough for local newspapers to turn him into a symbol of Southern revenge. But the busted safes don't back up the fairy tale. There's no reliable record of donations to widows, farmers, or laborers. The money kept the gang going and paid for increasingly daring escape routes. While headlines talked about heroic rebellion, eyewitnesses described violent robberies, terrified passengers, and guards shot in cold blood. So why did the Robin Hood image catch on so fast? Because stories that wrap crime in a cloak of justice help ease our guilt about rooting for the bad guys. It's easier to cheer for gunfire and explosions when we believe the target deserves it. That narrative trick, from folklore to streaming, creates an emotional shortcut that's hard to resist, seeing rebellion as redemption. Next time someone calls Jesse James a folk hero, remember to separate myth from evidence. The legend may shine bright, but the trail of gunpowder tells a different story, one that's far from over and well worth digging into. Number 25. The length of the Old West. For a long time, people believed the Old West stretched across the entire second half of the 19th century. But the lawless frontier that fills movies and novels actually fit into something closer to a single generation. Between the end of the Civil War in 1865 and the final official land designations around 1890, the territory changed with each passing season. Railroads cut through prairies, herds moved along cattle trails, towns popped up almost overnight, and conflict with native peoples hit its peak. When historian Frederick Jackson Turner declared the closing of the frontier in 1893, much of the West already had schools, courthouses, and sheriff's offices, enforcing laws that once seemed impossible. That short time span helps explain why the era took on such epic proportions. The shorter the period, the more room imagination has to fill in the blanks. Hollywood, dime novels, and traveling shows took isolated incidents, stretched out shootouts, polished up characters, and sold the idea of an endless era of vigilantes, smoky saloons, and high-noon duels. The myth grew so large that even today it's surprising to realize many of those iconic scenes never happened, or happened in far less dramatic ways. And with that, we wrap up our list of 25 busted myths. Which one surprised you the most by being false? Drop your thoughts in the comments. We love seeing the discussions that pop up there. If this ride through the real trails of the West kept your attention, show your support with a like. Subscribe to the channel and hit the bell so you don't miss the next historical adventure. Thanks for riding along, and see you on the next journey.